The stable boy saved a Duchess from a runaway carriage. By dawn, her coach stood at his cottage gate. His hands were still trembling when she kissed them. Not the polite brush of gratitude one might expect from a lady of her station, but a desperate press of lips against his scarred knuckles, her tears mixing with the blood that still wept from where the rains had cut deep. "You should have let me die," she whispered. And in that moment, standing in the wreckage of her carriage with her silk gown torn and her carefully constructed world shattered around her, Duchess Eleonora Ashford committed the first honest act of her 32 years. The stable boy, though he was hardly a boy at 26, merely poor, said nothing. He simply held her while she wept, his rough wool coat absorbing the grief of a woman who had finally, catastrophically, been seen. Wait, before the next confession unfolds, if this story has already stirred your heart, tell us where you're watching from. To make sure you don't miss the next betrayal, kiss, or redemption, subscribe and join our circle. The next heartbeat might change everything. Now, back to the scene. The fog had been murderous that November morning. It rolled off the moors like a living thing, thick and malevolent, swallowing the narrow road that carved through the Ashford estates. Thomas Blackwell had been returning from the village with grain for the horses when he heard it. The thunder of hooves moving far too fast, the wild screaming of terrified animals, and beneath it all, a sound that would haunt him forever. Silence. Not a cry, not a shout, just the eerie quiet of someone who had stopped fighting. He dropped the grain sacks and ran. The carriage appeared through the fog like a ghost ship, careening wildly as two massive black horses bolted in blind panic. The driver was gone, thrown or fled, Thomas couldn't tell. And through the window, he caught a flash of pale silk and darker hair. The woman inside wasn't even attempting to escape. She sat perfectly still, her hands folded in her lap, as if she were merely waiting for an appointment rather than hurtling toward the ravine that opened like a hungry mouth 50 yards ahead. Thomas didn't think. Thinking was a luxury for gentlemen in libraries, not for men who worked with their hands and understood that life could end in the space between heartbeats. He launched himself at the lead horse, catching its bridle and letting his weight drag against the animal's momentum. His shoulder screamed as it nearly tore from its socket. The horse reared, and for a terrible moment, Thomas hung suspended in air, certain he would be trampled. Then his boots found purchase on the muddy ground, and he hauled with every ounce of strength his 26 years of hard labor had built into his frame. The world became sound and fury, hooves striking earth, wood groaning. His own voice, hoarse and raw, speaking words he didn't remember learning. Gentle, firm, the language of frightened creatures. The horses fought him, but Thomas had been raised by a father who understood animals better than people, who had taught him that fear could be met with calm, that panic recognized stillness. When the carriage finally shuddered to a halt mere feet from the ravine's edge, Thomas's hands were ribbons of blood and his lungs burned like had swallowed fire. He barely registered the pain. All he could see was the door of the carriage, still closed, still silent. He stumbled to it, his legs threatening to give way. "Miss? Ma'am? Are you—" The door opened before he could finish, and she stepped out with such perfect grace that for a moment Thomas wondered if he'd imagined the entire incident. She was tall for a woman, nearly meeting his eyes, with dark hair that had come loose from its pins to frame a face that belonged in the portraits that hung in houses he would never enter. But it was her eyes that stopped him, gray as the fog around them, and utterly, terribly empty. "Thank you," she said, her voice as composed as if he'd merely held a door. "That was most kind." Then she looked at his hands, and something in her face cracked. "Oh, God," she whispered, and suddenly she wasn't a lady anymore, wasn't composed or graceful or any of the things her posture suggested. She was simply a woman staring at the blood that dripped from his fingers, and the emptiness in her eyes filled with something that looked like horror. "Oh God, what have I done?" "You've done nothing, ma'am," Thomas said, though his voice came out strangled. The pain was beginning to register now, a fire that spread from his palms up through his arms. "An accident, that's all. The fog—" "It wasn't an accident." The words fell between them like stones into still water. She was shaking now, violent tremors that made her silk gown shimmer in the weak light filtering through the fog. "I told William to drive fast. I told him not to stop, no matter what. Her voice broke. "I couldn't face another day of it, another morning waking up in that house, another night lying next to—" She stopped herself, pressing both hands to her mouth as if she could force the confession back inside. But it was too late. Thomas had heard, and more than that, he had understood. He had seen that look before, in his mother's eyes during the last year of his father's drinking, when she would stare out the window of their cottage as if willing herself to disappear. "You're in shock, Your Grace," he said, because he had recognized her now. Everyone in the county knew the Duchess of Ashford, even if only from a distance, glimpsed in her carriage or at church. "Let me help you sit down. I'll send for—" "No." The word came sharp and desperate. "Please, no one can know. If the Duke discovers that I—" She couldn't finish. Instead, she did something that would change both their lives forever. She reached for his mangled hands and brought them to her lips. That was when Thomas felt the first stirring of something that went beyond duty or propriety. Her tears were hot against his skin, and her lips were soft, and the way she held his hands, like they were something precious rather than the rough, calloused instruments of a working man, made something in his chest twist painfully. "You should have let me die," she whispered against his bloodied knuckles, and he heard the truth in it. This wasn't hysteria or shock. This was a woman who had meant every word she'd said to her driver, who had chosen death over another day of whatever life she was living. "No," Thomas said, and his voice came out rougher than he intended. "No, Your Grace. Whatever you're facing, it can't be worth that. It can't." She looked up at him then, really looked at him for the first time, and something passed between them that had no name. It was too large for gratitude, too raw for mere recognition. It was the look of two people who suddenly understood they were standing on the edge of something vast and dangerous. "You don't know what you've done," she said, but there was no anger in it, only a bone-deep weariness. "You've saved someone who didn't want to be saved." "Then I've saved someone who needed it anyway," Thomas replied. They stood there in the fog, a duchess and a stable boy, both bleeding in different ways. Around them, the world continued, the horses stamping nervously, the carriage listing slightly to one side, the ravine waiting silent and patient. But in that moment, they existed in a space outside of class and propriety, bound by the simple truth that he had seen her at her most desperate, and she had thanked him with tears instead of gold. "I can't go back," she said finally. "Not yet. If I go back now, he'll see it in my face. He'll know." "The Duke?" She nodded, not meeting his eyes. "My husband. He notices things. The smallest crack in my composure, the briefest hesitation. He notices, and he remembers, and he uses it." She drew a shaking breath. "I need time. Just an hour. Somewhere I can—" She gestured helplessly at her torn gown, her loose hair, her ravaged face. "Somewhere I can become myself again before I return to being his wife." Thomas should have refused. Should have insisted on taking her directly to Ashford Hall, propriety be damned. But he saw something in her face that his mother had worn toward the end, that desperate need for one moment of peace before facing the performance of daily life. "My cottage is a quarter-mile back," he heard himself say. "It's not much, but my sister's there. She'll help you with your dress, and there's water to wash with. I can stable the horses and check the carriage for damage while you—" He trailed off, uncertain how to finish. "While I learn how to breathe again," she finished for him. "Yes, thank you. She looked down at his hands again, and fresh tears spilled over. "But you need tending. Those wounds—" "I've had worse," Thomas lied. He hadn't, but some instinct told him that she needed to believe he was stronger than he felt, that her choice had cost him nothing. "Come, before the fog lifts and someone sees us." He helped her back into the carriage, then climbed up to the driver's seat. The reins were agony against his torn palms, but he gritted his teeth and urged the horses forward. Behind him, through the small window, he could feel her watching. He wondered what she saw. Just a stable boy doing his Christian duty, or something more? The cottage appeared through the fog like a benediction. It was humble, timber and stone, with a thatched roof that Thomas had repaired just last month, but it was clean and dry and blessedly private. His sister Margaret was hanging laundry when they arrived, and her eyes went wide at the sight of the ducal carriage in their small yard. "Thomas? What in heavens?" "Meg, I need your help." He climbed down, biting back a groan as his hands protested. "There's been an accident. Her Grace needs somewhere to rest and repair her dress before returning to the hall. Can you?" Margaret was already moving toward the carriage, her practical mind assessing the situation with the efficiency of a woman who'd been managing crises since she was old enough to work. "Bring her inside. I'll heat water and find something for those hands of yours." Eleonora stepped out of the carriage with Thomas's help, and he felt her hesitate at the threshold of the cottage. She had probably never been inside a working man's home before, never seen the reality of how the other half of her world lived. But she entered without complaint, ducking her head beneath the low doorframe. "Sit here, Your Grace," Margaret said, guiding her to the best chair they owned, which was still just rough wood, but sturdy. "Let me look at that dress. Thomas, water and bandages, now." For the next hour, Thomas sat at his own kitchen table while his sister cleaned and wrapped his hands, and the Duchess of Ashford sat across from him, watching with an intensity that made him uncomfortable. Margaret worked on the torn hem of Eleonora's gown with quick, efficient stitches, chattering away to fill the awkward silence. "Thomas was always good with horses," she said. "Even as a boy, he could calm them when no one else could. Our Da used to say he had magic in his hands." She glanced up at Eleonora. "Begging your pardon, Your Grace, I don't mean to speak so familiar." "Please," Eleonora said, and her voice was softer than before, less the Duchess and more the woman. "You're helping me. The least I can do is listen." Thomas caught her eye over Margaret's bent head, and something passed between them again, that strange, dangerous recognition. He should look away, should remember his place, but he couldn't seem to make himself do it. When Margaret finished with the dress and moved to fix Eleonora's hair, the Duchess finally spoke. "You live here alone? Just the two of you?" "Since our parents passed, yes," Margaret replied. "Ma died of fever 3 winters ago. Da followed 6 months later. Heart gave out, the doctor said, but we knew it was grief. They were that devoted." She pinned another lock of dark hair into place. "Thomas has been offered positions at bigger estates, but he stays here. Says he likes the quiet." "The quiet," Eleonora repeated, and there was something wistful in her voice. "I can't remember the last time I experienced true quiet." "Ashford Hall must be a grand place," Margaret said, clearly fishing for gossip. "Grand, yes." Eleonora's voice went flat. "Quiet, no. There are always people. Servants, visitors, the Duke's associates. always watching, always listening. One can never simply be. Thomas understood then. It wasn't just her husband she was fleeing. It was the weight of constant performance, the exhaustion of being seen without ever being known. He'd felt a shadow of it himself, working at the great houses. The way the gentry looked through servants as if they were furniture, necessary but unworthy of real notice. "You can be here," he said quietly, "for as long as you need." Eleonora's eyes found his, and he saw gratitude there, but also fear. "I should go soon. He'll have noticed my absence by now." "Let him notice," Margaret said, with the boldness of someone who had nothing to lose. "Begging your pardon, Your Grace, but any man who doesn't treasure his wife enough to ensure her safety doesn't deserve to have his concerns prioritized." "Meg," Thomas warned. But Eleonora laughed, a real laugh, startled and genuine. "You're absolutely right," she said, "though I doubt the Duke would appreciate such wisdom." She stood, and suddenly she was the Duchess again, her spine straight and her face composed. Margaret's work had transformed her back into the image of nobility, not a hair out of place, her dress mended invisibly, all evidence of her breakdown erased. But Thomas had seen beneath the mask. He would always know what it cost her to wear it. "Thank you," she said formally. "Both of you. I'm in your debt." "No debt, Your Grace," Thomas said, rising as well. His hands throbbed, but he ignored it. Anyone would have done the same. "But they didn't." She looked at him steadily. "You did, and I won't forget it." She left then, climbing back into her carriage with the grace of someone who had never fallen apart in a stable boy's arms. Thomas drove her to the edge of Ashford lands, where her own driver, found drunk in a tavern and sobered roughly by estate guards, took over with profuse apologies. The Duke's men gave Thomas suspicious looks, but said nothing. A duchess alone with a commoner for an hour would normally be the stuff of scandal, but no one wanted to be the first to voice such an accusation. As the carriage rolled away toward the great house on the hill, Thomas stood in the road and watched until it disappeared. He had a strange feeling that his life had just been divided into before and after, though he couldn't have said why. It was Margaret who voiced what he was thinking. "That woman is in trouble, Thomas. Deep trouble. I saw it in her eyes." "I know," he said quietly. "And you're going to try to help her, aren't you? Even though it could ruin you?" Thomas flexed his bandaged hands and felt the pull of torn flesh. "I already have," he said. He went to bed that night thinking of gray eyes and desperate kisses on bloodied hands. He told himself it was sympathy, nothing more. That any decent man would feel concern for a woman so obviously suffering. But when sleep finally came, it brought dreams of silk and tears, and the way she had looked at him like he was something more than just a servant. When he woke, it was still dark. For a moment, he lay there, disoriented, unsure what had roused him. Then he heard it, the sound of horses in the yard, the creak of carriage wheels. Thomas threw on his clothes and stumbled outside. Dawn was just beginning to break, painting the sky in shades of gray and pink. And there, impossible and undeniable, stood the Duchess of Ashford's private carriage, the one she used for personal errands. The driver was nowhere to be seen. The door opened, and she stepped out. She was dressed simply, for a duchess, in a dark traveling dress with no jewels, no elaborate styling. Her hair was bound in a simple braid. She looked younger somehow, and infinitely more fragile. "Your Grace," Thomas's voice came out rough with sleep and confusion. "What?" "I need your help," she said, and her voice shook with something that might have been fear or hope or both. "I need you to teach me how to live." And there, in the gray light of dawn, with his cottage behind him and her impossible request hanging in the air between them, Thomas Blackwell understood that his life would never be simple again. The scandal would take 3 days to reach its peak. Thomas didn't know that yet, standing in his yard with the Duchess of Ashford looking at him like he was her last hope of salvation. All he knew was that every instinct screamed for him to send her away, to protect himself from whatever storm she was bringing to his door. But those same gray eyes that had haunted his dreams were desperate and determined, and he found he couldn't refuse her any more than he could stop breathing. "Come inside," he said quietly, "before someone sees." She followed him into the cottage, moving with none of yesterday's hesitation. Margaret was already up, drawn by the sound of the carriage. She took one look at their unexpected guest and, to her credit, simply put the kettle on. "Tea, Your Grace?" she asked, as if duchesses appeared at their cottage every morning. "Please," Eleonora said. "And please, both of you. I know this is extraordinary. I know I have no right to impose myself upon you, but I have nowhere else to go." Thomas pulled out a chair for her at the table, acutely aware of how humble everything must seem to her eyes. The cottage was clean, but small, just 2 rooms really, with a loft where he slept. Margaret's bed was curtained off in the corner. There was a hearth, a table, a few shelves with dishes and books Thomas had collected over the years. Nothing grand, nothing worthy of a duchess. But Eleonora sat down as if the rough wooden chair was a throne, and when she folded her hands on the table, Thomas saw they were shaking. "Tell us what happened," he said gently. She drew a breath that seemed to hurt. "He knows. I don't know how, but he knows I tried to. That yesterday wasn't an accident. He was waiting when I returned. He didn't shout or strike me. That's not his way. He simply told me, very calmly, that he'd spoken with the driver before the guards found him. That William had confessed to my instructions." Margaret pressed a cup of tea into Eleanor's hands, and the Duchess wrapped her fingers around it like it was a lifeline. "What did he do?" Thomas asked, though he dreaded the answer. "He gave me a choice." Eleanor's voice was eerily calm now, the shock settling into something colder. "I could remain his wife, continue to fulfill my duties, and never speak of yesterday again. He would ensure that no whispers reach society, would maintain the fiction of our perfect marriage. Or," she paused, lifting the cup to her lips with hands that still trembled, "or he would have me declared insane, committed to an asylum for my own protection. He has a doctor who owes him favors, witnesses who would testify to my instability. He was very clear about what such places are like, what happens to women there." Margaret made a small sound of horror. Thomas felt rage kindle in his chest, hot and fierce. "He can't do that," he said. "There are laws." "He's the Duke of Ashford," Eleonora said with a bitter smile. "He is the law, in every way that matters. Who would challenge him? Who would believe a hysterical wife over a respected peer of the realm?" She set down the cup with exaggerated care. "But he made a mistake. He gave me until this morning to decide. He wanted me to spend the night imagining what I would lose, what horrors awaited me if I didn't submit. He thought fear would break me." "But it didn't," Thomas said quietly. "No." Eleanor looked at him, and her eyes were fierce now, burning with something that might have been madness or might have been the first spark of true freedom. "It showed me that I'm already living in a prison. At least in an asylum, I wouldn't have to pretend. At least there, everyone would know I was broken." "You're not broken," Margaret said fiercely. "You're trapped. That's different." "Is it?" Eleanora looked at her with genuine curiosity. "How do you tell the difference?" "Because broken things can't be fixed," Thomas said, "but trapped things can be freed." The words hung in the air between them, heavy with implication. Eleanora stared at him, and slowly something shifted in her expression. Hope, fragile and terrifying. "I don't know how to be free," she whispered. "I've been his wife for 10 years. Before that, I was my father's daughter, raised to be ornamental and obedient. I've never made a decision for myself, never earned a penny, never lived a single day without someone telling me what to do, what to wear, what to think. I don't even know who I am beneath all the rules and expectations." "Then learn," Thomas said simply. "Stay here, not forever. I know that's impossible, but for a little while. Stay and let yourself be someone other than the Duchess of Ashford. He'll come looking for me. Let him look. He'll ruin you, both of you." "We don't have much to ruin," Margaret pointed out. "We're already as low as society considers worth noticing." Eleonora looked between them, and tears spilled down her cheeks, not the desperate tears of yesterday, but something quieter, more profound. "Why would you do this for me? You don't know me. You owe me nothing." Thomas thought about how to answer that, about the way his mother had looked before she died, worn down by a hard man and a harder life, about the girl he'd loved when he was 17, a merchant's daughter who'd married a man twice her age because her father said so, and how the light had gone out of her eyes by the wedding breakfast, about all the small cruelties he'd witnessed in his 26 years, the way the world ground down anything soft or beautiful. "Because someone should," he said finally. "Because yesterday you kissed my bleeding hands and wept like your heart was breaking, and I saw you, not the Duchess, you, and I think maybe no one's really seen you in a very long time." Eleonora covered her face with her hands and wept in earnest then, great shaking sobs that seemed to tear out of her chest. Margaret moved to put an arm around her shoulders, and Thomas sat across from them both, his bandaged hands folded on the table, and wondered what had just committed himself to. When Eleonora finally composed herself, her face was blotchy and red, her eyes swollen. She looked nothing like the refined lady who'd stepped out of the carriage. She looked human. "Thank you," she said. "I'll stay just today, tonight at the latest. I simply need—" She gestured helplessly. "I need to not be her for a few hours. Is that terribly selfish?" "No," Margaret said firmly. "It's survival." They made a plan, such as it was. The carriage had been sent away. Eleonora had given the driver a story about visiting a sick tenant, told him to return in the evening. It was thin, but it would hold for a day. Thomas would go about his usual work at the estate stables, maintaining the appearance of normalcy. Margaret would stay with Eleonora, and together they would simply live. Cook, clean, talk. The mundane rituals that made up an ordinary life. "I don't know how to cook," Eleonora admitted. "I've never so much as boiled water." "Then you'll learn," Margaret said with a smile. "We're making bread today. You can help." Thomas left them to it, heading to the stables with his hands still aching under their bandages. He told the head groom he'd injured himself helping with a difficult horse, which was close enough to the truth. The man accepted it without question. Thomas was known as reliable, not prone to dramatics or lies. All day, as he worked with the horses, groomed coats and mucked stalls and repaired tack, his mind was at the cottage. He wondered what Eleonora was doing, whether she was finding any peace in the simplicity of Margaret's company. He wondered if she was regretting her impulsive flight, or if she was already planning how to return to her gilded cage. He wondered if the Duke was already searching for her. When Thomas returned home as the sun was setting, he found the cottage transformed. Not physically, it was still the same humble space, but the atmosphere had changed. Margaret and Eleonora were laughing, their hands white with flour, the table covered with slightly lopsided loaves of bread that smelled like heaven. Eleonora had abandoned her fine dress for one of Margaret's simpler ones, and her hair was tied back in a practical knot. She looked younger, lighter, as if a weight had been lifted. "Thomas," Margaret called out, "tell her she's not hopeless. She made that loaf, the one on the end." Thomas examined the bread in question. It was definitely misshapen, one side higher than the other, but it was bread nonetheless. "First try?" he asked. "First try," Eleonora confirmed, looking absurdly proud. "Then it's perfect," he said, and meant it. They ate dinner together, simple fare of bread and cheese and the vegetables from Margaret's garden. Eleonora ate with an appetite Thomas wouldn't have expected from a duchess, and she insisted on helping clean the dishes afterward, though she fumbled with the unfamiliar task. As darkness fell, Thomas realized he'd been avoiding the inevitable question. "What will you do tonight, Your Grace, when the carriage returns?" Eleonora set down the plate she'd been drying with painstaking care. "I don't know," she said quietly. "I know I should go back. I know every hour I stay here makes it worse. But She looked at him, and her eyes were pleading. "I feel more myself after one day in this cottage than I have in 10 years of being a duchess. Is that mad?" "No," Thomas said. "It's human." "He'll be furious," she continued. "He'll punish me for this. Not physically. He's too clever for that. But he has ways. Subtle ways. He'll isolate me further, control every aspect of my day, ensure I never have a moment's freedom again. And her voice broke, "I don't think I can bear it. Not after today. Not after remembering what it feels like to laugh, to make something with my own hands, to be treated like a person instead of an ornament." Margaret and Thomas exchanged glances. They both knew what was coming, could feel it building like a storm on the horizon. "Then don't go back," Margaret said. "Not tonight. Stay here. We'll figure out the rest tomorrow." "I can't ask that of you," Eleonora protested. "The scandal alone." "Is already going to happen," Thomas pointed out. "Another night won't make much difference, but it might give you time to think clearly, to make a real choice, instead of one driven by fear." Eleonora looked between them, and something in her face crumpled. "You're being so kind to me," she whispered. "I don't deserve it." "Everyone deserves kindness," Margaret said firmly, "even duchesses." So, Eleonora stayed. She took Margaret's bed while Margaret shared the loft with Thomas, a curtain rigged between them for propriety. It was scandalous beyond measure, a duchess sleeping under the same roof as a commoner, but somehow it felt right, natural. Thomas lay awake in the darkness, listening to the quiet sounds of the cottage settling, and tried not to think about the woman sleeping below. Tried not to remember the way she'd smiled when her bread came out of the oven, the joy in her face over something so simple. Tried not to acknowledge the dangerous warmth growing in his chest. He failed on all counts. When morning came, it brought the Duke of Ashford's guards. Thomas was feeding the chickens when he heard the horses, too many of them, moving with military precision. He looked up to see a dozen men in the Duke's livery riding into the yard, led by a man Thomas recognized as the captain of the guard, a hard-faced veteran named Cormac. His heart dropped. Beside him, Margaret had gone pale. Inside the cottage, Eleonora was still sleeping, or had been. The sound of the horses would wake her soon enough. "Thomas Blackwell?" Cormac dismounted, his hand resting on his sword hilt. Not a threat exactly, but a reminder. "We're looking for Her Grace, the Duchess of Ashford. We have reason to believe she may have sought refuge here." Thomas forced himself to stay calm. Why would a duchess seek refuge in a stable-boy's cottage? "Don't play games with me, boy." Cormac's voice was flat. "We know she was here yesterday. We know you brought her after the incident on the road. We know her carriage was sent here again the following morning." He took a step closer. "The Duke is very concerned for his wife's well-being. She's not herself lately, prone to delusions, fits of melancholy. He wants her home, where she can be properly cared for. The implication was clear. If Eleonora was here, she wasn't in her right mind. And Thomas, by harboring her, was either a fool or something worse. "She's not here," Thomas said, and prayed it wasn't too late, that Eleonora had heard the horses and had the presence of mind to hide. "She came yesterday to thank me for helping her, stayed an hour, then left. I haven't seen her since." "Then you won't mind if we search the premises?" It wasn't a question. Cormac gestured, and 6 of his men dismounted, moving toward the cottage. Thomas wanted to protest, wanted to physically block their path, but he knew how that would end. So he stood there, helpless, while they invaded his home. The search was thorough and not gentle. Thomas heard things breaking inside, heard Margaret's voice raised in protest. He closed his eyes and waited for the inevitable, for them to drag Eleonora out, for her to be proven a liar, for everything to come crashing down. But when the guards emerged, they were empty-handed. Cormac looked genuinely puzzled. "She's not here," one of the men reported. "We searched everywhere, even checked the loft and the root cellar." Thomas's eyes flew to the cottage. Through the window, he could see Margaret standing in the midst of the chaos, looking shaken but defiant. There was no sign of Eleonora. Where was she? Cormac studied Thomas with narrowed eyes. "If you're hiding her, if you've helped her flee, you'll hang for it. Kidnapping a duchess is a capital crime." "I haven't kidnapped anyone," Thomas said, and it was true. Whatever Eleonora had done, wherever she was, it had been her choice. "If her grace is missing, perhaps you should look elsewhere. Has the Duke considered that she might have friends, family, other places she might go?" "The Duchess has no friends," Cormac said flatly. He seemed to realize he'd said too much, his jaw tightening. "If you see her, if she contacts you, you're to send word immediately. Is that clear?" "Crystal," Thomas said. The guards mounted up and rode out, leaving destruction in their wake. Thomas waited until they were out of sight, then ran to the cottage. Margaret met him at the door, her eyes wild. "She's in the hidey hole," she whispered. Thomas's father had built it years ago, a small space beneath the floorboards where he'd hidden his meager savings from thieves. It was cramped and uncomfortable, barely large enough for a person to fit, and it would have been hell to spend even 10 minutes in. Together, they moved the furniture and pulled up the boards. Eleonora was curled in the darkness, white-faced and shaking. Thomas reached down and helped her out, and she collapsed against him the moment her feet touched solid ground. "They came," she said unnecessarily. "He sent them. He's not going to let me go." "No," Thomas agreed quietly. "He's not." They stood there in the wreckage of the cottage, holding each other, while Margaret put the furniture back in place. Thomas could feel Eleonora's heart racing against his chest, could feel her trembling with fear and adrenaline. "I'm sorry," she whispered. "I'm so sorry. I've brought this on you." "You've brought nothing," Thomas said firmly. "You're a woman trying to escape a terrible situation. That's not a crime." "It is when you're a duchess." She pulled back to look at him, and her eyes were haunted. "Don't you understand? I'm not a person in the eyes of the law. I'm property, his property, and you've stolen me." "I haven't stolen anything. You're here of your own will." "That won't matter." She was shaking her head now, panic rising. "He'll twist it. He'll make it look like you seduced me, manipulated me while I was vulnerable. He'll destroy you, Thomas, you and Margaret both." "Then we'd better make sure he can't find you," Margaret said practically. She was always the pragmatic one, the one who saw problems as puzzles to be solved rather than disasters to be lamented. "You can't stay here, that's obvious, but where can you go?" "Nowhere," Eleonora said hopelessly. "I have no money of my own, no property." "Every penny I touch is his. Every door I might knock on belongs to someone who owes him allegiance or fears his influence. Thomas thought quickly, his mind racing through options. My cousin Robert lives in the next county. He runs a coaching inn on the London Road. He's never met you, wouldn't know you by sight. You want me to work at an inn? Eleonora looked stunned. I want you somewhere safe, Thomas corrected. Somewhere the Duke wouldn't think to look. Robert's a good man. He'd take you on as a server or housemaid without asking too many questions, especially if I vouched for you. I don't know how to be a server or a housemaid. You didn't know how to make bread yesterday either, Margaret pointed out. You learned. Eleonora pressed her hands to her face, and Thomas could see her struggling with the enormity of what they were suggesting. To go from Duchess to servant, from the highest echelons of society to the lowest, from a life of luxury to one of hard labor, it was unthinkable, impossible. But so was going back. All right, she said finally. All right, when do we leave? Tonight, Thomas decided, after dark. I'll take you there myself. Margaret, can you prepare some supplies? Food, practical clothes, anything she might need? Already on it, Margaret said, moving toward the small chest where they kept their spare garments. The day passed in tense preparation. Thomas went to work at the stables again, maintaining his routine, while Margaret helped Eleonora prepare for her new life. When Thomas returned at dusk, he found the Duchess transformed once more. Not into the elegant lady he'd pulled from the carriage, but into a simple countrywoman. Her hair was hidden under a plain cap, her dress was homespun and practical, and she'd rubbed her hands with dirt until they looked work-worn. "Will I pass?" she asked nervously. "You look perfect," Thomas said, and meant it, not because she looked noble, but because she looked real, human, herself. They left after full dark, Thomas driving a borrowed cart with Eleonora hidden under sacks of grain. It was a risk. If anyone stopped them, if anyone looked too closely, it would all be over. But the night was moonless, and the roads were empty, and luck was with them. The journey took 3 hours. Thomas drove in silence, hyper-aware of the woman concealed behind him, wondering what she was thinking, whether she was regretting her choice, wondering if he was doing the right thing or leading her into worse disaster. Robert's Inn appeared around midnight, a cheerful building with warm light spilling from its windows. Thomas pulled the cart around to the back and helped Eleonora out. She emerged stiff and aching, bits of grain in her hair, but her eyes were determined. "Wait here," Thomas said. "Let me talk to Robert first." His cousin was behind the bar, serving the last few customers of the night. Robert was built like an ox, with a booming laugh and a generous heart. He took one look at Thomas's face and jerked his head toward the private quarters. In the small room behind the kitchen, Thomas explained, or at least he explained enough. A woman fleeing an abusive husband, a situation that could turn dangerous, the need for discretion and new identity. Robert listened without interrupting, then said simply, "Bring her in." When Thomas led Eleonora inside, Robert studied her for a long moment. Thomas wondered what his cousin saw, whether he recognized the refinement underneath the disguise, whether he suspected there was more to the story than a simple domestic dispute. But all Robert said was, "You can use the name Eleanor Black. I'll tell people you're a widow from up north, looking to start over. You'll work in the kitchen to start. It's easier to hide back there, and Mary can teach you what you need to know." He paused. "It won't be easy. The work's hard, the hours are long, and the customers can be difficult. But you'll be safe here, and you'll earn your keep." "Fair?" "More than fair, Eleonora." Eleanor now whispered, "Thank you." "Don't thank me yet," Robert said with a wry smile. "Wait until you've survived your first dinner rush." Thomas stayed long enough to see her settled in the small room she'd share with 2 other serving girls, long enough to make sure she understood how to find him if she needed help, Then, because there was nothing else he could do, he climbed back into the cart and started the long journey home. Dawn was breaking as he finally pulled into his yard. Margaret was waiting at the door, her face drawn with worry. "How is she?" she asked. "Scared," Thomas said honestly, but determined. He rubbed his face, exhaustion pulling at him. "Margaret, what have we done?" "Helped someone," his sister said firmly. "That's all. You helped someone who needed it." "The Duke won't see it that way." "Then the Duke can go hang," Margaret said with uncharacteristic venom. "I'm not sorry, Thomas. Even if this ends badly, even if we pay for it, I'm not sorry. That woman was dying by inches in that marriage, and we gave her a chance to live. How can that be wrong?" Thomas wished he had her certainty, but as he lay in his loft, unable to sleep despite his exhaustion, all he could think about was gray eyes and trembling hands, and the weight of a responsibility he hadn't asked for, but couldn't abandon. 3 days, he thought. It would take 3 days for the scandal to reach its peak. He had no idea how right he was. The Duke of Ashford was not a man given to public displays of emotion. So, when he appeared at Thomas's cottage on the 3rd day, accompanied not by guards but by a single lawyer, his calm demeanor was more terrifying than any rage could have been. Thomas was shoeing a horse when Margaret came running from the cottage, her face pale. "He's here," she gasped. "The Duke. He wants to speak with you." Thomas's hand stilled on the horse's hoof. For a moment, he considered running. Taking Margaret and fleeing, leaving everything behind. But that was the coward's way, and whatever else he might be, Thomas Blackwell was no coward. He put down his tools and walked to the cottage. The Duke was standing in the small yard, looking utterly out of place in his expensive clothes and polished boots. He was a handsome man, Thomas noted distantly, perhaps 40, with silver threading through dark hair and the kind of bearing that came from generations of unquestioned authority. Next to him stood a thin, nervous man clutching a leather case. "Mr. Blackwell." The Duke's voice was cultured, pleasant even. "Thank you for agreeing to speak with me." "Didn't realize I had a choice, Your Grace," Thomas said. A flicker of something, amusement, irritation, crossed the Duke's face. "You always have a choice, Mr. Blackwell. That's what makes this situation so interesting." He gestured to the cottage. "May we speak inside? What I have to say is best said privately." Against his better judgment, Thomas led them inside. Margaret hovered nervously, but the Duke waved her away. "This concerns your brother alone, Miss Blackwell, though I appreciate your loyalty to him." When they were alone, the lawyer standing silent and watchful, the Duke settled into Thomas's best chair as if it were a throne. He studied Thomas for a long moment, his expression unreadable. "I know where my wife is," he said finally. Thomas's heart stopped. He forced his face to remain neutral. "I don't—" "Please." The Duke held up a hand. "Let's not insult each other with denials. I know she's at the Golden Lion Inn, working under the name Eleanor Black. I've known since the day after she arrived." He paused. "What I haven't done is retrieve her." That surprised Thomas enough to show on his face. The Duke smiled, though it didn't reach his eyes. "You're wondering why?" he said. "Why I haven't sent my guards to drag her home, why I haven't had you abducting her." "Because I'm not a monster, Mr. Blackwell, despite what my wife may have told you. She said—" "I know what she said." The Duke's voice hardened slightly. "That I threaten to have her committed, that I control every aspect of her life, that I'm cruel and manipulative and have isolated her from everyone who might care for her." He paused. "She's not entirely wrong." The admission hung in the air. Thomas stared at him, unable to hide his shock. "I married Eleonora when she was 22, the Duke continued, a political alliance arranged by her father. She was beautiful, well-bred, everything a duchess should be. I thought we would have a civilized marriage, mutual respect, if not love, children eventually, the usual aristocratic arrangement. He stood, moving to the window to stare out at the yard. What I didn't anticipate was that she would be so utterly miserable, that every day in my house would drain a little more life from her. I tried to make her happy, gave her anything she asked for, didn't burden her with my presence more than necessary, never raised my voice or my hand to her. But nothing worked. She simply withered. "Because you didn't love her," Thomas said quietly. "I didn't know how," the Duke corrected. "I was raised to value duty, tradition, the appearance of propriety. Love was something that happened to other people, in novels and plays. It wasn't meant to be part of a noble marriage." He turned back to face Thomas. "But I'm not blind, Mr. Blackwell. I've watched her these past years, seen the way she looks at the servants who laugh together, the way she stands at windows staring at the world beyond like a prisoner. And when she tried to end her life, when I realized how desperate she'd become, I knew I had to make a choice." "You threatened her with an asylum," Thomas said, anger rising. "I threatened her with the consequences of her actions," the Duke said. "If she had died in that carriage, the scandal would have been immense." Suicide is a sin, a crime. Her family would have been shamed, her memory tainted. I offered her the asylum not as a punishment, but as an alternative, a way to explain her absence, to protect her reputation. By declaring her insane? By giving her time away from me, the Duke said softly, away from the life she found unbearable. Asylums are terrible places, yes, but the one I mentioned, it's private, expensive, more of a retreat than a prison. She would have been comfortable there, safe, able to rest and recover without the burden of being a duchess. Thomas shook his head. She didn't see it as a kindness. No, the Duke agreed. She saw it as a threat, another way to control her. And perhaps she was right. Perhaps everything I've done, even my attempts to help, has only made things worse. He moved closer to Thomas, his expression serious. "Which brings me to why I'm here." The lawyer stepped forward, opening his case to extract a sheaf of papers. The Duke took them, holding them out to Thomas. "This is a formal separation agreement," he said. "I'm offering Eleonora her freedom, a house in her name far from here, an allowance sufficient to live comfortably, the right to use her maiden name if she wishes. No constraints, no conditions, no claim on her beyond what the law requires for the marriage itself." Thomas took the papers, scanning them with growing disbelief. "You're just letting her go?" "I'm acknowledging that I've already lost her," the Duke said. "Perhaps I never truly had her. But I won't be the man who destroys what's left of her spirit by forcing her back into a cage, no matter how gilded." He paused. "There is, however, one condition." There it was. Thomas waited for the other shoe to drop. "She must come back long enough to sign these papers. They're not valid without her consent. And the Duke's voice wavered slightly, the first crack in his composure. "I need to apologize to her, face to face. I need her to know that I understand what I've done, even if I can't undo it. And if she refuses, then I'll have the papers drawn up in absentia," the Duke said. "She'll still have her freedom, though the legal process will take longer. But I'm hoping—" He stopped, seeming to struggle with the words. "I'm hoping she'll give me a chance to do this one thing right, to let her go with grace instead of cruelty." Thomas looked at the papers in his hands, then back at the Duke. "Why are you telling me this? Why not go to her directly?" "Because she'll never agree to see me on my request alone," the Duke said simply. "But she might agree if you ask her to. She trusts you, Mr. Blackwell. Heaven knows why, but she does. You're the one who saved her life, quite literally. You're the one who helped her escape when she saw no other way out. If you tell her this is legitimate, that I mean what I say, she'll listen." It was manipulation, Thomas realized. Elegant and subtle, but manipulation nonetheless. The Duke was using Thomas's relationship with Eleonora, such as it was, to get what he wanted. But as Thomas looked at the papers, at the promise of freedom they represented, he couldn't bring himself to care about the Duke's methods. "I'll ask her," he said finally. "But the choice is hers. I won't pressure her." "I wouldn't want you to," the Duke said. "If she says no, if she prefers to hide for the rest of her life rather than face me for 5 minutes, I'll respect that. But give her the option, please." Thomas nodded slowly. "How do I contact you?" "If she agrees." The lawyer spoke for the first time, his voice thin and reedy. "Send word to Ashford Hall. We'll arrange a meeting place, somewhere neutral where the Duchess will feel safe." The Duke moved toward the door, then paused. "One more thing, Mr. Blackwell. I know there's been talk, gossip about you and my wife. I want you to know that I don't believe it. Eleonora is many things, but she's not an adulteress. And you," he smiled faintly. "You have the look of a man who respects honor too much to take advantage of a vulnerable woman." "Thank you, Your Grace," Thomas said, unsure if he should feel complimented or insulted. When they were gone, Margaret emerged from where she'd been listening at the curtain. "Do you believe him?" she asked. "I don't know," Thomas admitted, "but I believe the papers are real, and I believe Eleonora deserves to know about them." He made the journey to the inn that same day, riding this time rather than taking the cart. The miles passed in a blur of thought, about the Duke's offer, about Eleonora's choices, about the strange twist of fate that had brought them all to this point. Robert met him at the door, looking worried. "She's in the kitchen," he said quietly, "and Thomas, she's struggling. The work is harder than she expected, and some of the customers have been cruel. Mary's teaching her as fast as she can, but—" He trailed off, shaking his head. Thomas found her elbow-deep in dishwater, her hands red and raw from the lye soap. She looked thinner than she had 3 days ago, exhausted in a way that went beyond physical labor. But when she saw him, her face lit up with something that made his chest ache. "Thomas!" She dried her hands quickly, wincing at the roughness. "Is everything all right? Margaret?" "Everyone's fine," he assured her, "but I need to talk to you. Somewhere private?" They walked to the inn's small garden, away from curious ears. Thomas explained everything: the Duke's visit, the papers, the offer of separation. He watched her face carefully, trying to read her reaction. "He wants to see me," she said when he finished. Not a question, but a statement of fact. "He wants to apologize," Thomas said, "and he wants you to have the choice. Freedom, but only if you're willing to face him one last time." Eleonora was silent for a long moment, staring at her damaged hands. "Do you believe him?" she asked. "Do you think this is real?" "I don't know the Duke," Thomas said honestly, "but I read the papers. They're legal and binding. If you sign them, you'll have everything he promised: a home, an income, independence. You won't be his wife in anything but name." "But I'll have to see him." "Yes." She closed her eyes. "I swore I'd never go back, never let him control me again." "This isn't about control," Thomas said gently. "It's about closure, a chance to end things on your terms instead of his. And if it's a trick, if he has me declared insane the moment I step foot on his property—" "We won't meet at Ashford Hall," Thomas promised. "We'll choose the location, somewhere public, somewhere safe. I'll be there with you the entire time." Eleonora looked at him, and he saw fear in her eyes, but also something else, a spark of hope, fragile but growing. "You'd come with me?" "Of course." She reached for his hand, and he let her take it, feeling the roughness of her work-damaged skin against his own calluses. "These 3 days," she said quietly, "have been the hardest of my life. I'm terrible at this, Thomas. I burn the food, I drop the dishes, I can't keep up with the orders. The other girls are kind, but I can see them wondering why Robert hired me. I'm useless here." "You're not useless," Thomas said firmly. "You're learning." "I'm failing," she corrected, "and I know that even if I eventually learn, even if I become good at this work, I'll never truly be one of them. I'll always be the Duchess playing at being a commoner. This was a fantasy, a desperate escape, but it's not a life I can sustain." She looked up at him, tears gathering in her eyes. "I think I have to go back. Not to him, not to being his wife, but I have to face what I ran from." "Then I'll be there," Thomas promised, "every step of the way." She squeezed his hand, then let go. "Tell him I agree. I'll meet him. But, Thomas," her voice dropped to a whisper, "stay close, please. I don't think I can do this without you." "You won't have to," he said. They arranged it all through the lawyer, a meeting in 1 week's time at a small church halfway between Ashford Hall and the inn, public enough to be safe, private enough to speak freely. Thomas, Margaret, and Eleanor would arrive together. The Duke would come with only his lawyer, no guards, no servants to witness or judge. The week passed in strange suspension. Eleanor continued working at the inn, though Robert had mercifully moved her to simpler tasks. Thomas went about his duties at the stables, fielding curious questions about the Duke's visit and deflecting gossip with bland assurances. Margaret prepared, in her practical way, for every possible outcome, packing bags in case they needed to flee, hiding what little money they had, even sharpening the old knife their father had used for protection. On the appointed day, they set out at dawn. Eleanor had borrowed a dress from one of the other serving girls, simple but respectable. She'd pulled her hair back in a style that was neither Duchess nor servant, but something in between, a woman finding her own way. The church appeared through the morning mist, small and ancient, its stones covered in moss. Thomas felt Eleanor tense beside him in the cart. "You can still change your mind," he said quietly. "No," she said, "I can't. Not anymore." The Duke was already there, standing by his carriage with the thin lawyer beside him. He was dressed simply, for a duke, without the ostentatious display of wealth he might have worn. When he saw Eleanor climbing down from the cart, something flickered across his face, relief, perhaps, or regret. "Eleonora," he said, and his voice was gentler than Thomas had expected. "Thank you for coming." "Your Grace," she replied, her voice steady despite the tremor Thomas could feel running through her. "I understand you have papers for me to sign." "In a moment." The Duke took a step closer, then stopped, as if an invisible barrier prevented him from approaching further. "First, I need to say something. I've spent the past week thinking about how to phrase this, rehearsing speeches, but now that you're here, all the careful words have fled." He drew a breath. "I'm sorry." Eleanor said nothing, just waited. "I'm sorry for making you a prisoner in your own life," the Duke continued. "I'm sorry for not seeing how much you were suffering, or for seeing it and not knowing how to help. I'm sorry for threatening you instead of releasing you, for trying to control even your misery. Most of all, I'm sorry for the 10 years we've lost. You to unhappiness, me to willful blindness." "You're sorry," Eleanor repeated, and there was something in her voice that Thomas couldn't quite identify. "That's it? 10 years of my life, and you're sorry? What else can I offer?" The Duke spread his hands helplessly. "I can't give you back the time we've wasted. I can't erase the loneliness, or the fear, or the desperation that drove you to seek death rather than face another day as my wife. All I can do is set you free, and hope that whatever life you build from here is happier than what you had with me." Eleanor was crying now, silent tears streaming down her face. "I wanted so badly to hate you," she whispered. "It would have been easier if you were cruel. If you beat me, you're raged, or gave me a clear enemy to fight against. But you were always so reasonable, so civilized, so perfectly correct. I kept thinking it was my fault, that I was broken for not being able to love you. You're not broken, the Duke said. You never were. We were simply wrong for each other, bound by duty instead of choice. That's not your failure. It's not even mine, really. It's the failure of a system that values family alliances over personal happiness. Is that supposed to comfort me? No, the Duke said. Nothing I say can comfort you. But perhaps it can give you permission to stop blaming yourself. You did nothing wrong, Eleonora. You tried. God knows you tried. But trying isn't always enough. They stood there in the churchyard, noble and peasant, husband and wife, stranger and stranger. Thomas felt like an intruder, witnessing something too intimate for outside eyes, but he stayed close, as he'd promised. "The papers," Eleanor said finally. The lawyer stepped forward with his case, withdrawing the documents Thomas had seen days before. He spread them on a stone bench, pointing out where signatures were required. "Everything is as I promised," the Duke said. "A house in Somerset, far from Ashford and the society that would judge you. An annual income of £500, paid quarterly. You'll keep the title of Duchess, though you're free to use your maiden name if you prefer. I'll not contest any arrangement you make, nor will I ask questions about how you choose to live your life." "And in return?" Eleanor asked, scanning the papers. "In return, nothing," the Duke said. "This is not a transaction. There are no conditions. You're simply free." Eleanor looked at Thomas, and he saw the question in her eyes. He nodded slightly. "The papers are legitimate," he said. "I had Robert's lawyer look at them. Everything he's saying is there in writing." Still, she hesitated. "Why?" she asked the Duke. "Why are you doing this? You could force me back, could have me declared insane, could make my life hell. Why let me go?" The Duke was quiet for a long moment. "Because watching you try to die was the first time I truly saw you," he said. "Not as a duchess, not as a duty, but as a person. A desperately unhappy person who deserved better than what I could give her. And—" he stopped, seeming to struggle with the words. "Because if I claim to be a good man, if I want to believe that nobility is more than just birth and wealth, then I have to act nobly, even when it costs me." "What does it cost you?" Eleanor asked. "Pride," the Duke said simply. "The appearance of a successful marriage, the alliance with your family, the belief that I can control outcomes through sheer will and money." He smiled faintly. "More than you might think, less than you're worth." Eleanor picked up the pen, dipped it in ink, and for a moment Thomas thought she would sign immediately. But she paused, the pen hovering over the paper. "If I sign this," she said slowly, "I'm admitting defeat, admitting that 10 years of my life were wasted, that I failed as a wife." "No," Margaret said suddenly, speaking for the first time. She'd been standing back, watching, but now she stepped forward. "If you sign this, you're choosing life. You're saying that your happiness matters more than what society expects. That's not defeat. That's courage." Eleanor looked at her, then at Thomas, then finally back at the Duke. "Will you remember me?" she asked him. "In 5 years, 10, will you remember my name?" "I'll remember you every day," the Duke said quietly, "as the woman who taught me that kindness and control are not the same thing, as the person I failed and the lesson I needed to learn." Eleanor signed. Her hand was steady as she wrote her name, not the elaborate, practiced signature of a duchess, but something simpler, more honest. When she finished, she set down the pen and stepped back, and Thomas saw her shoulders straighten, saw a weight lift that he hadn't even realized she was carrying. "Thank you," the Duke said. He signed his own name below hers, followed by the lawyer's witness mark. You'll have access to your accounts by next week. The house is currently being prepared. I've taken the liberty of furnishing it simply, but you can change anything you like. It's yours. I don't even know what I like, Eleanor said with a sad smile. I've spent so long being what others needed me to be that I've forgotten who I am. Then you'll have time to discover it, the Duke said. That's the greatest gift I can give you. Time. Use it well. He bowed, formally, as if they were meeting at a ball rather than a churchyard. Then he climbed into his carriage and left, the lawyer following in a separate conveyance. They didn't look back. When they were gone, Eleanor collapsed onto the stone bench, her whole body shaking. Thomas sat beside her, and Margaret took her other side, and they held her while she wept, not tears of sadness, but of release, of a grief so profound it could only now be expressed. "What do I do now?" Eleanor asked when she could speak again. "I have freedom, I have money, I have time, but I don't have a purpose. I don't have a life." "Then we'll build you one," Thomas said, "together." She looked at him, and he saw the question forming before she asked it. "Why? Why do you keep helping me? You've already done so much, risked so much. You don't owe me anything." Thomas thought about how to answer that, about the way she'd kissed his bloody hands, about the joy on her face when she'd made bread, about the feeling in his chest every time she smiled, about how somewhere in the past week she'd stopped being a duchess he was helping and become simply Eleanor, a woman he couldn't imagine not knowing. "Because," he said carefully, "everyone deserves someone in their corner, someone who sees them, not what they represent. And he paused, searching for the right words. "I see you, Eleanor, not the Duchess, not the runaway wife, just you, and I think you're worth knowing." Margaret cleared her throat. "Also, someone needs to teach you how to actually make bread that doesn't look like a lumpy rock. That's important too." Eleanor laughed, watery but genuine. "Both excellent reasons," she said. She stood, smoothing down her borrowed dress. "So, Somerset, a new house, a new life. I suppose I'll need help setting it up. People who know how a real home functions, not a show house for entertaining lords and ladies." "We could visit," Margaret offered. "Help you get settled." "Or," Eleanor said, looking at Thomas, "you could stay, both of you. The house will be large enough. It'll need staff anyway, and I'd rather have people I trust than strangers." She hurried on before they could protest. "I'd pay you, of course, fair wages. You'd have your own quarters, your own lives. But we'd be together, friends if nothing else." Thomas exchanged glances with Margaret. Leaving their cottage, the only home they'd known, to start over in a strange county with a woman they'd known less than 2 weeks? It was mad, impossible. "Yes," Margaret said. "Absolutely yes." "Thomas?" Eleanor asked, and there was something vulnerable in her voice, a fear of rejection that he couldn't bear. "Yes," he said, "I'll come." Her smile could have lit the whole churchyard. They made their plans there in the shadow of the ancient church. Margaret would stay at the cottage long enough to settle their affairs, sell what they couldn't take, inform the estate that Thomas was leaving his position. Eleanor would go on ahead to Somerset, see the house, begin the process of making it home. Thomas would escort her there, ensure she arrived safely, then return for Margaret. It would take a month, maybe more. A month of endings and beginnings, of closing doors and opening new ones. As they rode away from the church, Thomas looked back once. The Duke's carriage was long gone, disappeared into the distance like a memory fading. But the church remained, ancient and permanent, a witness to vows made and vows broken, to love found and love lost, to all the messy, complicated ways that human hearts tried to find their way home. The house in Somerset was a revelation. Thomas had been expecting something modest, a cottage perhaps, or a small manor suitable for a widow of means. What he found instead was a small estate that straddled the line between nobility and gentry, grand enough to be comfortable but not so large as to draw unwanted attention. "The Duke chose well," Eleanor said, as they stood in the drive, staring up at the honey-colored stone. "It's beautiful, but not ostentatious. I could be happy here." Could be, not will be. Thomas noted the careful hedging, the way she protected herself even from hope.